Welcome to the Broken Pie Chart Podcast, episode number 90. I'm your host, Derek Moore. This week, I'm actually going to do an episode on a question I get a lot, not only from listeners, but also from other people about, the idea of, is your house an asset or is it a liability? And that also dovetails into other questions like, well, is it better to buy a house or to rent? Do you get a better return on buying a house versus, let's say, putting money into the stock market vis-a-vis, the S&P 500? And this is one of those subjects that endeavors quite a bit of opinion on both sides of it. And so, a lot of people say, hey, real estate's the best thing to do. Other people say, you know what, the stock market's better. And there's sort of pros and cons to each. The renting versus buying, and we did at least one episode, if not two, and I'll link to those if I can remember which episodes they were. But, if you look at renting versus buying, there's quite a bit of nuance there as well. So is your house a liability or is it an asset? And, some people who say, look, it's a liability, they might point to Robert Kiyosaki, who wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And I think the point, and I'm doing this, somebody rephrased this recently, the point that they make is something's not an asset unless it generates, cash flow. And so I'm not going to use that strict of a definition because you could certainly, let's say buy stocks. Maybe they don't pay a dividend. Many years, Microsoft, Apple didn't pay dividends, but their total return, which is any appreciation and any dividends that they pay, certainly you would have been rewarded over the years. So when we think about assets, an asset typically is something that, you own, has the ability to go up in value. And when you look at a house, that certainly can happen. Your house can go up in value. But one of the interesting things with a house is, and this sort of goes into the whole idea of, is real estate better? Is owning a house, should I pay off my mortgage? Should I put all my extra money into a house? Or, should I invest in the stock market? And one of the things I think is pretty interesting about a house is, there's obviously expenses. And I'll give you some numbers about what the median home price was, 1980, 2000. And if you would have bought, theoretically, what you would have made on an annualized basis. But you look at a house, and if I were to just give you a house today, just give it to you, say, here you go. Does that mean you have no expenses? The answer, of course, is no. If you were gifted a house, I find somebody on the street and it happens to be you, and I say, here's my house, you can have it. Here's the keys, sign over all the paperwork. But what do you have? Well, each year you have to pay property taxes. So property taxes, that's an expense. You have to pay insurance. That's certainly an expense. If you live in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association and they have dues, that can be an expense. Of course, sometimes those expenses also cover, your landscaping, or sometimes, if you live in a condo, it might include the roof, a bit of insurance as well. But, that can be an expense. Electricity and heating. Yeah, but you would have that if you rented too. So I'll kind of touch on that. That's an important distinction because unless you are, living on somebody's couch rent-free, or living with, your parents or other relatives, a brother, a sister, somebody, you would have those expenses anyway. That's kind of like, you're like, oh, if I own a house, I have to have internet. Well, if you rented, you're probably going to have internet too, right? But so you think about that, you just get gifted a house. And so in some ways, it is a liability. It's a liability because, you owe taxes, insurance. What about repairs and maintenance? Anyone who's ever owned a house knows that. And besides, just redoing things. So if you ever owned a house and you're like, I want to redo the kitchen, the counters, I want to paint, any of that stuff. But just general maintenance, like every X number of years, the hot water heater goes out. Okay, that's anywhere, I don't even know what it is. It's probably somewhere between $400 and $900. Okay, so that can happen, especially if you have a plumber come out and do it. I certainly don't know how to install a hot water heater. But you could also have, what if you need a new roof, or you need to replace the air conditioning? You need to paint. Something in the bathroom breaks. You have a sprinkler system in your yard. So, there's any number of things that could, call it depreciation. You're going to have to, to keep the house going in a good state, good working state. You're going to have things break. You're going to have items that you need to repair or improve. And yeah, of course, if you want to put new kitchen cabinets in, that's going to be an expense as well. So if you're renting, you certainly don't have those things. Now, the good thing about owning a home is that it's actually a little bit of a hedge on inflation. So, if you buy a home today and we assume inflation's like 2% a year or something like that, whatever it is, the theory is at least your home, and historically this has been true over time, home prices should go up at least with the rate of inflation. So, you should be getting 2%, 3%, something like that a year. And the timing matters too. When you buy a home could certainly be important. But yeah, it's a little bit of a hedge on inflation. Also, if you have a mortgage, now a lot of people say, I don't want to have a mortgage, or I should put every last dollar I can into paying the mortgage down. And I'll have some thoughts on that too. But, let's say that you take a 30-year fixed mortgage out and your payments are fixed. In other words, if there's inflation in the next 20 years, 15 years, let's say year 15, you're still paying that same mortgage amount, excluding taxes going up and insurance and things like that. But just on the principal and the interest, your payments are fixed. So that's one of the positives. Plus, so you're on it's kind of like if you made $20,000 in late 70s, it's probably equivalent to like 100-something thousand today on an inflation adjusted basis. And it's the same thing. If your mortgage payment was $2,000, if let's say your mortgage payment's $2,000 today, well, in 20 years, if inflation goes up, you would assume that home prices go up. Who knows what interest rates are going to be when you do your loan? But on an inflation adjusted basis, you actually get the benefit of having the old basis before inflation hit, if that makes sense. And so there's definitely positive to that, even though you have taxes, insurance, depreciation. The other thing too is with interest rates so low, it used to be when rates were much higher, 7, 8, 9%. At the beginning of when you first started paying your loan, most of the payment that you made was made up of interest only, almost all interest. Only a small amount went to equity. Well, now with a 30-year mortgage, the average is 3%, although I don't know if you actually get 3%, especially without paying any points today. But, let's say if it's 3%, each payment that you make, it's not 50-50 on day one, but it's not a majority of interest anymore. Early on, the majority is still interest, but a good portion of that payment is going to be towards your equity. And so with rates so low, you actually start to build equity a little bit sooner with those payments. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. And that is a benefit to homeowners. And so the positive is, you do get, it's sort of a hedge on inflation. If you have a fixed loan, you have certainty about what your payment's going to be. If you rent, certainly who knows what your rent's going to be? It could go up, could go down. But if your rent's not fixed, like it would be with a mortgage. So there's a lot of benefits to owning a home. There are some tax benefits, hedge against inflation. But I think it's a good point. Is your house an asset or a liability? Well, okay, let's think about it another way. What if we compare it to stocks? And again, you have to sort of live somewhere, right? So we're going to take living on somebody's couch rent-free out of the equation. And pretty much you're either going to rent or you're going to buy some variation of that. But, compared to stocks, are stocks and assets, are they a liability? Well, let's think about it for a second. Now, of course, your home, unless you rent out a room, it doesn't pay you any dividends. Stocks potentially could pay you dividends, so that would be income. That's interesting. And you wouldn't pay taxes you pay taxes, let's say, in a taxable account on dividends. And of course, anything in an IRA, you wouldn't pay taxes on until much later when you start to draw money out. But yeah, you would have no taxes. No taxes in IRAs, you would have paid taxes on dividends, but the appreciation, you wouldn't have a taxable event until you actually disposed of the asset. Again, excluding IRAs where that wouldn't be. By the way, stocks don't need a new roof or an air conditioner or to be painted. And so in that regard, stocks are much more of an asset than a home, because I could give you stocks and let's say, it pays the dividend and it's a taxable account. You would wind up paying, ordinary income or some variation of that on dividends. But unless you sold it, you wouldn't necessarily have any tax liability until you sold it. You wouldn't have to do maintenance on it. You wouldn't have to mow the lawn in front of your stocks. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think when just to kind of, before we get into, what is, some people think homes appreciate more than they do, but before we get to that, I do think a home it's a little bit mixed. It's both an asset and a liability. And, certainly I could give you a home, like I said, and you would owe money every year, every month maybe. So there's definitely depreciation. There's definitely cost associated with owning it. But in theory, it is a hedge on inflation, and you can, there's some interesting things with regards to how you look at things on inflation. Now, a lot of people point to houses and they always say, well, I've doubled my money on this house, or I've done, but over what time? Over what period? Did you buy it in 1930 and now it's gone up so much? And so here, and this is regardless of, whether we're looking at home prices or any type of asset, you have to look at the compounded growth rate. You have to annualize those returns. In other words, let's say you bought a house and 10 years later, excluding anything that you put into it or paid in interest, and it doubled. Well, that's roughly about a 7.1, 7.2 annualized, percent gain on that. So to give you some numbers, and I realize that all of this is, they always say real estate is local, and how do you know, did you get a good deal? You always say, by the way, no one ever buys a house or a car for that matter and says, yeah, I really didn't get a good deal. Everyone always says they got a good deal. Sellers a lot of times say they got a good deal too. But anyway, so I'll give you some numbers here. I pulled this up on the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. This is the median home price. So that throws out, the top, throws out the very bottom. It's sort of the middle range, for lack of, more complex explanation. But I'll give you some numbers. In 1980, the median home price beginning in 1980 was like $63,700. Okay. In 2020, and this is the end of Q2, median home price, and this is in the U.S., $313,200. And you say, whoa, $63,700 to $313,000. And that sounds really good. Okay. Well, it's actually plus $249,000. That's a 392% return. But you need to sort of annualize that, because when you annualize it, it sort of says, hey, on an annual basis, what was the compounded growth rate each year that worked out to? And if you do that, it's roughly about 4%. annualized compounded growth rate, annualized gain. Put a comparison on that, the total return of the S&P, that had an annualized return of roughly 12% over that same time. And so, anyway, so give you some numbers there. Now 1980 is unfortunately getting longer and longer ago. So let's pull it from 2000. Let's say you bought a home in 2000 and, in 2020, that same thing. And I know people will listen to this and say, wait a second, didn't home prices go up in Q3? We don't have the numbers yet. But yeah, we can assume it probably went up a little bit. And so the median home price 2000 was 165,300. So using the same 313 and change, that's an 89.47% gain. On an annualized basis, that's about 3.2%. And if you want to sort of think about a stock, how stocks did over that same period, it's about 6.7%. All right. So, and some people will say, wait a second, I know my neighbor and he's really good about buying houses. And so just to kind of put an example on this, let's say instead of buying at 165,000, and I get it, you could buy a home for much less. Maybe you don't spend as much how to fix houses and stuff. Or maybe you bought a house that was more in price, less in price. I don't have all that data, right? I just have the median. So what if instead of paying $165,300 in 2000, you actually were able to get it at a 20% discount? In other words, you only paid $132,240 instead of $165 and change. What would that do to your annualized return? Well, instead of 89%, 89.5%, let's call it, it'd be just under 137%. But annualized, it's about 4.8%. So getting the house at a 20% discount would have got you about a 4.8% annualized return versus about a 3.2. So sure, it definitely increased things. But here's one of the things that a lot of people don't take into account when they look at, hey, I bought the home here, I sold it here, I made this unbelievable profit. And that is, they don't take into account a couple things. Of course, there's the opportunity cost. What could you have made on another investment, other projects, something like that. But let's look at that $165,000 house that you buy, the median house in 2000. The median property tax today in the U.S., and this is going to be all over the place. Like people in New Jersey and California are going to be like, this isn't even close. But the median is about $2,279. So, the median household paying about that. I realize some states it's more, some states it's less. So let's, it probably has gone up in the last 20 years. So just some estimation. And I said, probably if we average about $1,600 a year, maybe $1,800 a year in taxes, over 20 years, you would have paid about $36,000 in taxes. Okay, just making up some hypotheticals here. Let's say you had to spend $10,000 on a roof or other stuff, reseal a driveway, fix sprinklers, whatever the heck it is. And let's say that, I don't know, probably in 20 years, is it unreasonable to think you probably spent, 10 to 20 grand just on other stuff, whether it's the toilets broke, the sprinklers, the pool, maybe you painted, all this other stuff. So, let's say 36 in taxes, 30 or so in maintenance, some things that you did and things like that. So my point of doing this, if you're adding another 66,000 to your cost theoretically. And so instead of 165, what if you made your cost basis about 231,000? And then when you sold it, instead of getting 313, you paid, 5% commission on the home. So you really only netted about 298. So then your return over 20 years is about 29%, and that's annualized. It's about 1.7% annualized return. So I show these numbers to you. It's not to say you shouldn't buy a house. It's just historically, and you can Google the Robert Shiller numbers. If inflation's averaged, 2.5% over X number of years, I think he makes the point in his book, Irrational Exuberance, that, pretty much home prices return about, on average, what inflation's been. He also, I don't want to get too complicated, but he also makes the point that after inflation, home prices historically have really provided little real return. Now, of course, depends when you buy. Did you buy at the bottom of the market in March of 2009? Yeah, your return's a little bit higher. But so I show that to you as just a thing to think about. And so as we sort of round things out a little bit, there's a couple things. Number one is a house an asset or a liability? I say it's an asset, but it's a liability as well. Can I say it's both? I think I can. It's my podcast. I don't necessarily agree that it's not completely an asset. And the way to do this you'd have to say, well, what do I spend on a house? What would I spend to rent? And then you'd have to sort of net those things out and think about, did you get any appreciation? The other thing is, is it a good idea to throw all your money towards paying off a mortgage? I would say in general, and circumstances are different, but probably, the challenge with having all your equity in the house and no other assets like stocks or exposure to markets or other assets is that, you've got tons of exposure in one sector, and it's housing. And the other challenge is if you had, emergency expenses come up or you need money for something, you've either got to take a loan on the house or you've got to sell the house, and then where are you going to live, right? So a house is not a completely liquid asset. So in my opinion, there's probably a nice blend of putting money away, whether it's 401k or other assets, as opposed to just having the 100% sole focus of paying down your mortgage. Remember that mortgage payment, as inflation goes up, that is on an inflation-adjusted basis. It's actually your cost in theory will go down. So a house is a hedge a little bit. The other thing I would tell you is that, who knows what's going to happen with housing prices and who knows what's going to happen with the market. Those numbers I gave you, no idea if that's going to continue. But I can tell you historically, stocks, like the S&P 500, broad market indexes, they have realized a higher annualized compounded growth rate than homes have. So, and this doesn't, by the way, get into owning a home and then renting. I mean, that's really outside the scope of this discussion. Sure, if you own a home and you own another home and you rent it out, as an asset, I don't know, a lot of people I talk to wind up having all sorts of hassles being landlords, but some people love it. So, but that's not my area of expertise by any means. So I think that, and one little thing to take away from this is, it's always good to keep the size of, let's say, the home that you're buying, or what type of mortgage, what type of cash flow you're going to have in perspective. And so one of the mistakes people can make is buying, too expensive a house, a big commitment from a monthly cash flow standpoint, and then maybe they don't have any extra funds to put towards, accumulating an investment account and things like that. So, things to think about. All right. We're going to leave it there. Please, instead of wasting time rating and reviewing, go ahead and share this with someone. Appreciate the questions and comments that come in, and continue to share it. I can see when people are doing that because we see the numbers continue to go up. Don't forget, not next week. Next week we'll be back with a normal episode, but then on, I think it's Friday the 30th, we're going to be back doing our pre-election podcast. We're going to look at not only the investment implications and what the market is sort of forecasting, but also we'll have the chance to prognosticate a bit, make some predictions, review what we're seeing in the polls, what we're seeing, and it will either be spot on, or probably an episode you'll never have to listen to again if we're wrong. So that's going to be coming up in 2 weeks. All right, folks, have a great week. We'll talk to you next time.